I first want to begin sort of by introducing myself. If you could advance to the next slide there. So, of course, I'm the new guy in town, but my background is in planning and real estate development. I've sort of worked on all sides of the equation, looking on the public and private side, but also in an academic setting through my work at the University of Arizona. I often joke that I'm an urban planner trapped in an entrepreneur's body. So I've spent a lot of time, working in municipal government. But I've also started my own company. So I had a real estate software analytics company. In addition to a real estate development practice out west, I've done development projects in California, Texas, and Arizona. Ultimately, what it comes down to, though, is I have a passion for urban development. And, I had an interview with the mayor, about a month ago, right before I started, and we talked about that to a great extent. And we also talked about the fact that the way we live and work is changing. And it is really incumbent upon us on the public side to help guide that change and make sure that our policy is aligned with the goals of the private sector. And that's sort of where I try to represent that divide and that intersection. So, putting a little finer tooth a point on that. Looking at key trends in real estate for 2020 will be the theme of the discussion today. I'm going to try to answer Clay's question about what about me, right? And say, what's this, what's the meaning for Norwalk? And then discuss the role of redevelopment and how that's changed over the years and how we're trying to guide that into the future. So why is redevelopment important, right? Redevelopment is an archaic term, and some people would say, that came from the 1950s to deal with blight and the conditions. But really what I'm here to argue today is redevelopment is the thing of the future. And the reason is that it's expected over the next 30 years, more than $30 trillion is expected to be invested in rebuilding the existing built environment. That's not new greenfield development, that's not more suburbanization of America. What we're talking about is rebuilding what we already have. You get a lot of press around the age of infrastructure, a lot of press around sort of the generational divide, which I'm going to talk about today, and how that's influencing the real estate market and how that's influencing the work we do on the public side to make it a reality. And just to put it into perspective, that's more than half of all the construction spending in the US is expected to be done in redevelopment in existing areas. So the first trend that I kind of want to discuss is the fact that America is aging, right? It sounds grim, but I think it's an opportunity. And that's really how I want you to think about all this today. And it's an opportunity that the city of Norwalk has done a tremendous job, coming into this fresh and capitalizing upon. And we want to continue to do so. And a lot of this is driven by demographics, right? It's the underlying fabric of America. It's what our consumer preferences are. It's what we want to see in our communities, and it's what we need to actually capture as a market. And a lot of it is driven by the baby boom, right? Between the years of 1946 to 1964, the United States witnessed its largest population expansion. And that is undoubtedly going to have ripple effects through our consumer preference and consumer demand. So it's, with 76 million new people coming into the population during the baby boom, those are the people that we have to accommodate demand for today while addressing the current needs of the current population. So we look at the millennial, you get a lot of press around the two topics, right? You have the baby boom generation and the millennials, and a lot of that is because they're the two largest segments of our population right now. They represent over 60% of demand, 60 to 70% of demand. If you want to advance. So, why this is significant is we're feeling the impacts of this today. The baby boom generation is turning 65 between 2011 and 2029. We're right in the middle of it. And the importance of that for real estate is that as you age, your needs change, right? You may not have that sort of peak demand in your life for the largest house, your kids are away at college, or you're downsizing. And that has significant implications because that's 32% of the entire population that we're talking about. So if their needs are changing and our real estate markets cannot respond to those changes, there's going to be a mismatch, and we have to try to reconcile that. You can advance to the next slide. So where is this growth occurring? And I think, the perception is that, millennials are driving a lot of this growth because they love buying expensive coffee and eating avocado toast in cities, right? But it's not necessarily just that. What you're looking at, the majority of the growth is actually driven by people in their empty nester years. So this is from 2019, a report issued by ULI, and it shows that that over 10 million people are in the urban areas are in their empty nester years, which is double that of the millennial generation. So it's it's really that change in consumer preference that is driving this shift to the urban areas rather than just the younger generations. If you could advance the slide. And a lot of this, too, is driven by the fact that household composition is changing. This is the second trend I kind of want to examine. And if you look at birth trends over the last century, we're on a steep decline. The overall trending line going downward is indicative of people marrying later, which is happening all across the nation, and having less children. So that decreases their need for space. So what does that mean for us? And we'll kind of continue along that path here. And it means a lot in terms of market demand. You have only 20% of household growth between 2015 and 2050 is projected to have children in them. And nearly half of the household growth will be single person. That's more than 2.3 times the overall growth. If you could advance here. And just one more slide. I don't mean to, it's early, I know. I'm not going to hit you all with a pop quiz, but it's open slide. So we'll kind of talk about that if you want to go back. The question is how many homes would then be needed to house 1.2 million people when the average household size is, say, two people? And that would be 600,000 homes. If that increased to 3 people, that would be 400,000 homes. But if it decreases, as it's projected to decrease, to 1.2 persons per household, that's 1.2 million homes, which makes the supply-demand equation difficult on our side, that we need to provide as much supply of what the market wants to accommodate demand in order to stabilize prices and keep communities healthy, ultimately, is what it comes down to. So taking that forward, taking a look at the fact that America is aging, taking a look at that household composition is changing, what we're ultimately seeing in the market is additional competition for starter and downsize housing, which is actually what the gentleman from Webster Bank, Stephen, was talking about. You need to produce a certain number of housing to keep up with demand in order to stabilize the economy and stabilize prices. But in terms of the overall projections that we're looking at, between 2015 and 2050, 64% of the new housing demand will be for starter or downsized households, which means gradually increasing competition for smaller houses. So it's incumbent upon the development community, working with Spinnaker to provide that supply and other developers to accommodate, demand in the market. So if we advance to the next slide, we could say, okay, what does this mean for Norwalk and why Clay, ultimately? Basically, you started it, all right? This isn't me. So we were fortunate to have, though, what I wanted to look at. I'm coming new to town. I have these ideas. I've seen what's gone on at the national level, but I wanted to take a look at specifically at Norwalk because that's what's important. And looking at the 2018 ACS housing survey data, which just came out about a week ago, we're seeing some important indicators that we need to be cognizant of and align our policy to them. Generally, homeownership rates are decreasing. It's relatively modest because Connecticut is, relatively suburban state for a majority of that. But the renter percentage is actually going up. If you want to advance to the next slide. And rental housing is dominating new household growth and tenure, which is actually common across the nation. So I saw a statistic actually that compared the current national home ownership rate to renter percentage at about 25% to 75%. And in 2050, that's actually projected to almost stabilize to have 54% renters to 50% ownership. So people are wanting to rent more, and they're choosing to rent more. It's not that they're forced to rent more, and there's a number of reasons for that, right? You're looking at economic mobility, which is a huge issue. People, are products of the recession, and they needed to move to get a new job. So they want to maintain that flexibility. And what we're finding is that millennials don't necessarily want what the boomers have, right? And that's one of the big problems for the real estate market in Connecticut when you're looking at it is, people may not want that large space as we're kind of talking about, and that's just a product of consumer preference. So, being real with the situation and making sure that we make planning and real estate decisions that align with those figures. Unfortunately, as a result of this, home values have declined, but if you advance to the next slide, rent has gone up. And that's an affordability issue, right? And the affordability is not just a social issue, it's an economic issue. And what it comes down to is that in order to keep the cost of labor down, you need to keep the cost of living down as well. If it's more expensive for people to relocate to Connecticut, it's going to be more expensive for you to employ them, thereby increasing the burden that we all talk about all the time about how do we bring jobs back to Connecticut. So housing and community development is a fundamental point of all that. And in order to sort of remove these barriers, we have to have open discussion about these topics within the context of our policy. So in terms of my general observations, I know I unpacked a lot of detail in terms of the overall market and some key trends. what it is just being cognizant that a lot of officials and citizens who elect them, of course not in Norwalk, assume that past demographics and homeownership rates will prevail into the future. And that's just a common assumption. You know, you assume that things are going to project out as you've experienced them, but I think the numbers are telling something different, and we need to be cognizant of that. Because the reason is that those public officials can make planning and real estate decisions that will oversupply single-family detached housing and undersupply higher density housing, throwing off that equation. And if you undersupply attached housing, the rents go up and prices of detached homes go down. It's just a simple supply and demand economics 101 sort of curve. And the reason why that's important to all of us in this room is that it increases the cost of living and doing business for residents and employers, and ultimately creates a barrier for economic development. And that's what we're trying to do, is remove barriers for economic development, working with the city's economic development department. And that is, you know, a key goal of some of the work that we're planning to perform under the new leadership. So what is our role, right? What is the role of redevelopment specifically? And if you could advance to the next slide. The way I see it, you know, 1 month in, or 5 weeks in, is that we're here to provide strategic assistance for economic development projects and ultimately to derive competitive advantage. And that's a business term, right? That's not a public sector term typically that is used. But I think Norwalk stands the most to gain in this whole environment because they have the existing infrastructure to support attached development, and they have the political leadership to do so. One thing I've said multiple times already, you know, coming to the communities, I've never been more impressed by a city in terms of their boards, their commissions, their city staff, and their leadership. They all get it. They're all, you have a very high caliber, high performing municipal staff, and I think this is why you have a competitive advantage. You will derive. No, not yet, not yet. That's coming. No, but I'm being honest. At the end of the day, that's a barrier. If you don't have that, that's a barrier. And you do have that here. It's a human capital component that is a factor to derive that competitive advantage. And ultimately what we're trying to do is to create a municipal structure to optimize the land development process, because redevelopment specifically is complex. It's hard. Infill development is not easy as building a house in the middle of a green field, you know, elsewhere. They require strategic partnerships between the public and private sector. And what our role is then, okay, if you look at public-private partnerships, that term gets a lot of press, right? The idea behind public-private partnerships is that the project is made better by both parties collaborating. It's actually made better than one party doing it on their own. So there's a joint value, a symbiotic relationship. But the fact of the matter is, on the public side, we are here to represent the public, and we need to make sure that a public good is derived from any such investment. So that is where we come into play. We want to represent the public parties to our fullest extent, have policy goals, whatever those may be, and make sure we're using our leverage and our investment capacity to achieve those goals through involvement with the private sector. And ultimately, it's not doom and gloom, especially for Norwalk, because you guys are situated to capitalize upon this, again, because you have the infrastructure, you have the political will, and it's ultimately to realize an opportunity at this point. I look at this as a positive. The fact that consumer preferences are changing and Norwalk's able to align and respond to that will ultimately be positive for the community and attract investment. So that's really the generalized approach here, and I think, you know, demographics sound boring, but they really affect your day-to-day life. So I appreciate the opportunity to present to you all.
Before he sits down, any questions for Brian here? Yeah, we have one in the back there.
I thought I covered it perfectly.
I don't know if you could address that end of it. I'm an architect by trade, so I know that there's a trend towards that, with online shopping, there's not a need for, you know, the abundance of retail. How does that fit into the equation with millennials?
Yeah, well, I think, you know, mixed use is very important, but it needs to be strategic, right? You need to put it in the right place, because just because you want a mixed use building doesn't mean the market can support every use in that building. So it really needs to align to market demand. It fits within the equation too, because you have, like, for instance, let's take office space, right? Say I want to have a mixed use building with residential up top and office. Well, the office rate is the office vacancy rate is what, 28% in Connecticut right now? So I can't, you know, be forced on a planning side to build a building that I can't fill, right? That's not going to work, and that's not going to be good for anyone, because you'll have vacant space on the bottom, and you're not getting the sort of the benefits that people talk about with mixed use, about activating the street and doing, those sort of urbanization, the trends in urbanization in that matter. I think also one of the things that you have to consider is mixed use financing is difficult and it's complex, right? Because there's a lot of different ways you have to underwrite it specifically around, the particular use that you're getting. And I think that it's a challenge ultimately, but I think it's very important because you have, you want to have that diversification in your portfolio of land uses ultimately.
Where's the biggest growth out of all those three categories, retail, office, and housing? Or I should say, where's the projected change in the growth? Because I know housing is, the obvious one,
Yeah.
but how do you see office, how do you see retail?
Well, residential for sure is the biggest growth based on the sort of demand conditions that I presented on. There's much ado about retail. I actually give a lecture on that at the University of Arizona. There's a lot of concern in that regard, but it's really just going to be about the strategic placing of it, right? Because people still do shop, but it's more of an entertainment use as opposed to or customer service focus use as opposed to actual just, people are shopping a lot online. Office is interesting though, actually. Although the trends in office, they vary obviously nationwide. What you're seeing is although the net space per user is decreasing, the overall space is actually increasing nationwide. And that's for it gets compensated, maybe not in Connecticut, but in California where you have these big open co-working spaces that are just huge and palatial in some instances. So the overall space is actually increasing, but the net space per worker, they're getting assigned to smaller stations, if that makes sense. Yes?
Can you say something about the possible overbuilding or inadequate building of upscale senior communities?
Yeah. So what do you mean by inadequate, just to clarify?
Well, so there are a lot of them going up. They're just opening. They've just opened. They're just about to open. And it feels like a lot of living space for a lot of residents. But maybe compared to our population, maybe that's not the case. So I don't know whether it's overbuilding or underbuilding.
Yeah, I mean, what we're seeing a lot in terms of global, I'm not in terms of size, right, is actually underbuilding. I mean, there's an incredible demand that's coming on, and we're in the middle of it. So I think that's what those sort of developments are trying to do is respond and deal with what I discussed in terms of the generational shift, right? So I think it's important to monitor, and there's a whole body of literature around market demand-based planning, right? And that's kind of where I'm looking at things right now is trying to align our planning objectives and our policies with market demand. It's a much more analytical approach. It's a much more detail-oriented approach, but the devil's in the details, right? And I think that's what we're trying to wrap our head around on the public side of things to make sure that we're adequately accommodating demand. One of the things, talking about, large-scale macroeconomic conditions is of course the recession. And I think pre-recession, everyone thought the risk of development was inherent to the developer, and that would be moderate. But what we learned when all of a sudden the housing crashed and municipalities had to lay off workers, they had to cut education benefits, that risk is not solely shouldered by them. We do shoulder some risk. So we need to align our policies and really think about those in detail to accommodate the shifts that we're kind of talking about with the style of development that you're asking. Any other questions? I don't mean to run off stage, but all right, thank you.